Not so long ago, a plague swept the country and Americans lived in fear.
It was like a phantom enemy, this illness, and I was scared to death as a young mother.
Children got sick and died by the thousands.
There are a lot of parents who live in fear. I know I do. The fear, my friends, is polio.
In just one terrible year, polio claimed more than 50,000 children.
And they would be screaming, and the anxiety level was unbelievable.
Then Americans united behind a pioneering scientist and made medical history.
It works, they were yelling.
Today, we're closer than ever to wiping polio from the globe.
Well, I wake up every day thinking, are we doing everything we can?
This is the story of how it all began, with a shot to save the world. The arrival of summer brings joy and sweet freedom. But back in the 1930s and 40s, Americans dreaded summer because this was the start of polio season.
When we look back upon polio today, you look back upon what was really a summer plague. It came every year. It came like locusts, and newspapers would have almost baseball box scores of the numbers of kids who would come down with it in that week. It would start around late May and go up in June and higher in July and spike in August. And then by Labor Day, the summer plague would be over.
Polio can strike at any age, but it mainly affects children under the age of 5.
It would hit this kid and not this kid, and nobody knew why. It would descend on Denver, but not on San Francisco, and no one knew why. All you knew was that every summer, thousands of very unlucky kids would come down with this insidious disease that usually left them incapacitated and often killed them.
Whenever you have an epidemic disease that seems to come out of nowhere and all sorts of children are getting sick, there's great fear, and kids don't go to the pool, they don't go to school.
Data from the time shows how polio gained a terrifying foothold. In the 30s, the worst year affected some 9,700 people. In the 40s, the numbers grew, and by 1952, outbreaks hit a record 57,000 victims in 1 year alone.
You looked at these children walking down the street as if they had gone to war. I mean, it was as if they were veterans of a foreign war, and it was young children. I think it was just a very, very emotional disease for this country.
At the time, very little was known about polio, or as it was also called, infantile paralysis.
It was known by then that it was a virus disease, but there was no way to treat it. And there wasn't really sure how it was transmitted. People weren't sure.
There was a tremendous amount of myth and misinformation that surrounded the disease. People thought that the disease was spread by cats. They thought it was spread by fleas. They thought that it was spread by organ grinders monkeys. They thought that it was spread by bananas that had been imported from South America. They thought that it could be cured by ox blood or sassafras or wood shavings.
People had all kinds of theories about it. You shouldn't take your kids to a public pool. Nobody should give birthday parties. I mean, it was like a phantom enemy, this illness, and I was scared to death as a young mother.
Polio is spread person to person by sneezing, coughing, and contact with human waste. But nobody knew that back then.
There was no prevention. There was no cure. There was no protection. You could be a good parent, a bad parent, an indifferent parent, and you still had no way of protecting your child against polio.
What doctors did know about the disease was devastating.
The virus reproduces in the mouth, it reproduces in the intestine, gets into the blood, and invades the nervous system. And what it does is it kills a particular cell in the nervous system called the interior horn cell. And this cell tells the muscles what to do. It's like cutting the wires to a light bulb. The light goes off.
The disease was also highly contagious.
Polio would spread silently and then pick out its victim and continue to spread silently, pick out another victim.
It was a diagnosis of uncertainty. Sometimes it came and went like the flu and left no lasting damage. In many cases, polio caused paralysis, and even though it was often temporary, paralysis was particularly dangerous when it affected the lungs.
I caught polio when I was 21 months old, back in 1952. Our house was immediately quarantined. Started showing signs of paralysis. And at that time, you got in an iron lung. That was what happened. And I was in an iron lung for approximately 11 days.
The iron lung was an early respirator. Patients laid inside a sealed chamber that used alternating pressure on the body to inflate, then deflate the lungs.
The image of kids having to be put into iron lungs, if you're not able to control your diaphragm muscles during that time period, the machine basically is breathing for you. Now, a lot of kids eventually regain control of their diaphragm muscles, so their time in the iron lung is finite, but it's a pretty gruesome thing where, you know, you're sort of inside a machine that's breathing for you.
We would get these children coming up and they would be screaming, and the anxiety level was unbelievable. You try to comfort them, and how do you comfort a 4 or 5-year-old? He didn't even have his teddy bear. He could take nothing with him.
And I remember the faces on some of these kids, you know, in agony. Just picture your own 2-year-old, you know, can't breathe, and it's just dreadful.
The lucky ones would survive, but suffer lasting problems like pain, weakness, and atrophy of the muscles.
You just try to keep them alive with artificial breathing and physical therapy, and then try to equip them with some kind of gear that would help them walk again if you've managed to save their lives.
Kids in wheelchairs and leg braces became a tragically common sight. And thousands of families mourned for their children who had not survived. Worst of all, everyone knew the plague would return, summer after summer. And so the stage was set for a president, a scientist, and the American people to beat back the disease that crippled the nation.
Really, when you talk about polio or infantile paralysis, you must in the United States begin with FDR, with President Roosevelt. He got it at the age of 39 in 1921 and spent the rest of his life really trying to find the cure and the prevention. He never found the cure. He died in 1945 still having polio. But what Roosevelt did was to put together a voluntary organization that was absolutely extraordinary.
Roosevelt's organization was called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which later became the March of Dimes. It started in 1938.
And its goal was to collect money to do research to conquer children's diseases, and polio was its primary target. A dime was the currency of the time that was a meaningful contribution from a child.
Their door-to-door fundraising program was called the Mother's March.
Fight polio tonight. Let the marching mothers know you're waiting for them.
The March of Dimes people would go around, go door to door. And so actually in the 50s, the majority of all disease money that was raised for polio.
I remember going out with my mother on the Mother's March, and you would go around the neighborhood, and if the light were on the front porch, then I would go to the house and collect a little cardboard thing that had inserts for coins to go in, and we would gather those and ship those literally to the White House.
The dimes came pouring in. In the first year, more than $1 million worth. Polio became a national cause, headed by the president. And even Hollywood got on board to help.
There are a lot of parents whose children are healthy and happy now, who live in fear. I know I do. The fear, my friends, is polio.
What made the March of Dimes such an extraordinary organization was that, for one thing, they used the latest techniques in advertising and public relations. They got celebrities like Mickey Rooney and Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley. And I have a picture in my book of a very uncomfortable Richard Nixon pumping gas for polio. They also used poster children. Give me your money and help me walk. And it was dime by dime by dime. These were Americans pulling together. And they were pulling together to some degree because this was a children's disease. And having a visual disease where you saw leg braces and you saw crutches and you saw iron lungs was something that was simply intolerable to the American conscience. And they united as a people to do away with it.
I like it.
FDR died in 1945, but the March of Dimes carried on. One of the organization's goals was to create a polio vaccine. 2 years later, they sought out a young doctor by the name of Jonas Salk. Salk was just 33 years old at the time, running his own lab at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine and working on a vaccine for influenza. A polio vaccine would need to combat all known types of the polio virus, and there were 3 types that scientists knew about. Salk's first step was to make sure there weren't more by performing a process called typing.
My father had an opportunity to participate in the complete drudgery of the poliovirus typing program. And that's something that no budding scientist at the beginning of his or her career would want to take on, but this was an entree.
And what Salk understands very early on is that, you sort of go where the money is. And the money was coming from the National Foundation with very, very large grants for polio.
Here was a place he could get started. The good news was that there was a philanthropical base that was going to support him here. The bad news was it was Pittsburgh, which at the time was in the backwater of science.
And in this backwater of science, the work itself was also far from glamorous.
Dr. Salk and his research team were in the basement. They were looking for the live polio virus. And so when a patient has to have a bowel movement, we would cover the bedpan with a sterile towel and run to the door. And sitting out in the hall on wooden benches would be Pitt medical students. That was their primary job, was to grab that bedpan and have it down in the lab, probably within a minute or 2. And that's where Dr. Salk isolated the live polio virus from a young male patient at Municipal Hospital.
This was the job that prominent researchers, prominent virologists would not do. It was scut work, it was hard work, it was uninteresting work. But what Jonas Salk intuitively understood was that it was the kind of work that would get him on the March of Dimes bandwagon.
After 3 painstaking years, Salk confirmed that there were only 3 types of polio virus. The March of Dimes then engaged Salk to work on the vaccine Americans so desperately wanted.
He was the miracle worker in the white coat on the one hand, but he was also an incredibly hard-working, devoted scientist for whom people were willing to sacrifice. And Jonas Salk, at the University of Pittsburgh, put together an extraordinary team of researchers. And what Salk did was sort of direct this team and whip this team and move it in a single direction. And that direction was to put out a polio vaccine as quickly as possible.
As the lab got more funding, Salk expanded from 2 rooms to more than 2 floors. The space even housed mice and monkeys, which were used in a variety of ways during the typing and vaccine creation.
We had our own animal colonies on the 2nd floor. We had rhesus monkeys and then later on cynomolgus monkeys. And by the way, we made all of our own food for the monkeys. That food was made in our basement, in the vitamins and supplements that we purchased.
The monkeys would wake up at 6 a.m. and they would grab their food pans and they would clang them against the bars of their cages. What a racket. And we would look at each other and smile and say, we have 1 hour to go. You know, so we called it monkey time.
Inside the lab, Salk was working on a radical idea. Vaccines work by giving the body minuscule doses of a disease, which encourages the production of antibodies that create immunity. The conventional wisdom was that the best vaccine needed to contain a live virus. But Salk believed a polio vaccine could use a killed virus to produce an effective immune response. It wasn't an unprecedented idea, but it certainly wasn't the accepted science.
He was challenging medical orthodoxy. All of the ordained ministers of virology said you have to have a live virus in the vaccine to stop polio. And Jonas kept saying, no, I think we can fake the body into manufacturing these protective antibodies by giving them killed vaccine.
Jonas Salk and his team had to figure out a way to take 3 types of poliovirus and to kill it with formaldehyde, but to kill it in such a way that it could still be juiced up to trick your immune system into producing antibodies.
Salk wanted a vaccine that was effective, but also safe. Even then, the public worried about vaccines that caused harm. No one had forgotten what happened decades before, when early polio vaccines ended in disaster and dead children.
That was a horribly flawed concept and resulted in a horribly flawed vaccine that caused polio in some children. So this was the mid-1930s, and I think it casts a pall over polio research for a solid 20 years. And because you knew that in the mid-1930s, there were researchers that gave a polio vaccine that caused polio.
The first attempt with an inactivated polio vaccine killed kids. So the way was clear what not to do, in a sense.
Salk believed the killed virus vaccine was the safest and most effective approach.
He loved the idea. It's like, God, if you can prevent people from getting a disease without putting them at a risk, why not? And it was, you know, there was a certain sort of humane spirit to it.
It was enlightened, and this was very, very big pioneering stuff in terms of how vaccination became a common sense thing.
Of course, with pioneering ideas, criticism often follows. Salk's most vocal opponent was Dr. Albert Sabin, a virologist in Cincinnati.
Albert Sabin was the vaccine orthodoxy, and I think he poo-pooed Salk because he felt that Salk's notion of taking a polio virus and completely inactivating it with formaldehyde as a way to make a lifelong vaccine was ridiculous. The problem, however, was that Sabin had an enormous amount of influence, and partly because he was very good at inserting himself among those who shared his belief, which were the big virologists at the time.
Jonas was the one who fought all those outside battles. He fought the immunization committee that was almost unanimously opposed to a killed vaccine, with Sabin leading the charge.
Not coincidentally, Sabin was at work on his own polio vaccine using the live virus.
And what you have are very competent, very ambitious, very competitive scientists in a kind of frantic race, although they deny they're in a race. They're fully in a race.
Dr. Sabin came to the lab once, and he sort of looked over my shoulder. He said, you won't be doing that next month. So he was very negative, let's say.
It was a David and Goliath story. The elite establishment scientist with all the allies versus the younger man in a working-class town with the radical new approach. For Salk and Sabin, it was the rivalry of a lifetime, with the lives of American children at stake. Sabin had legitimate scientific questions about Salk's approach to the vaccine.
There were several concerns about the killed vaccine. One is, would it induce long-term, lifelong immunity? Obviously, when you start with a vaccine, you don't know that.
Most experts at the time believed the key to lasting immunity was to create a low-grade natural infection in the body, something they thought a killed virus couldn't do. And that wasn't the only objection.
All our vaccines, with the exception of tetanus, work two ways. One is individual protection, which is, of course, not 100%. And then the other is what's called herd immunity. If you vaccinate enough people, you protect those who can't be vaccinated for one reason or another.
When a large population or herd is injected with a vaccine, they create a sort of firewall that can prevent an outbreak from becoming an epidemic. With a live virus vaccine, scientists knew about an added bonus. Recipients shed minute amounts of the still living virus, which can be transmitted to other people. This passive vaccination expands the ranks of the herd and helps limit outbreaks. Sabin and others believed the killed virus vaccine would only protect an individual, while the live virus vaccine would more effectively protect many people. Regardless of the controversy, the March of Dimes funded both Salk and Sabin in an effort to find a vaccine as soon as possible. Salk not only believed his approach was the best, he also believed he could produce his vaccine more quickly than Sabin. The president of the March of Dimes made all the research possible. His name was Basil O'Connor.
O'Connor was a close friend, a law associate of FDR. My dad learned a tremendous amount from O'Connor about how to get things done in the world, about how boards run, how to get things politically through.
Basil O'Connor had complete and total confidence in what we were doing. The one man now, who isn't even a scientist or an MD, was really making the decisions for our work to continue to go on.
The stakes couldn't be higher. Every day that it took to make that vaccine was a day that some children around the United States got polio. And kids are dying every year. And as Basil O'Connor, head of the National Foundation, says, this is a scientist who sees beyond the microscope.
We didn't have to really be stimulated very much by what was going on around us, because up on the third floor was the polio ward where they had all the iron lungs. So all you had to do was go and look in there, and you didn't need much more incentive.
Jonas said that at one time he felt like he was riding a horse and being whipped all the time because O'Connor wanted to get it done, get it done. Jonas says, we're talking about a vaccine. I don't even know if we have a vaccine. I'm talking about an experimental preparation. O'Connor says, Jonas, you have a vaccine, and we got to use it. There's no sense of saying it's 5 years away or 10 years away. Let's get moving and have it sooner rather than later.
The team raced ahead. By 1951, Salk was ready to test some experimental vaccines on humans. though this tense first trial would cause him many sleepless nights. The subjects would be 43 patients at the D.T. Watson Home for Crippled Children, run by Dr. Jesse Wright.
The Watson Home were all kids who had polio. So in some sense, there's less risk involved. And so Dr. Jesse Wright worked with my father and courageously allowed her kids at that institution to be the first to receive the vaccine.
The kids at the Watson Home wouldn't be cured by the vaccine. But because they'd already had polio, they were in no danger of contracting the disease a second time. It was a brilliant safety measure, if the families would agree.
These are a group of people that were very visionary. They knew that they suffered and they wanted to help other people not suffer. And the people that were headed to Watson Home explained this to the kids that, hey, what we're trying is something new that's going to help other people. It may not help you, but the children all knew it. The parents of the children were all for it too.
And I thought, oh boy, this is great. I'm going to get the shot. I'm going to be able to run around and walk again and go play ball. The doctor said, no, it's not going to prevent what happened. It's going to prevent it happening to other people like your brother. I said, fine.
Salk took a blood sample from each child, then gave them the shot. A few weeks later, blood was drawn again. If the new samples showed increased antibodies, Salk would know the vaccine worked.
Is he nervous when he begins human testing? Of course he's nervous. He literally goes to those places every night to see how the kids are doing. But they had tremendous faith in Jonas Salk. He was a father. He tested the vaccine on himself. He tested the vaccine on his children.
Yes, Donna, his wife, she says, oh yeah, he gave the kids the shots. They screamed.
There's a picture of me getting a vaccination that's clearly a setup shot. I mean, it's just a wonderful quintessential 50s photograph.
I mean, it wasn't fair to go ask other people to take the vaccine when we didn't take it ourselves. So we vaccinated one another, we vaccinated our children before we went to the world.
Weeks later, the suspense was broken. The data was in, and the experiment worked.
He knew that it was possible to immunize humans effectively with this inactivated preparation.
That broke the orthodoxy, frankly, that was established by the leading virologists at the time. And he was, in that sense, a good decade ahead of his time. And he proved it, and still people didn't believe it.
After Salk ran successful tests in the Watson School, the March of Dimes felt that he was going to have to run a small study in the schools in and surrounding Pittsburgh.
Testing on kids with polio was one thing, but now it was time to inject healthy kids. In February of 1954, Pittsburgh stepped up to the plate and enrolled 7,500 of their own children to receive the first shots.
Once the word started getting around about some progress being made, there was no lack of volunteers. Parents were willing to turn their kids right over. They were convinced long before Salk, this is going to work, this is it.
And I think there was a tremendous pride that it was being done in their city, with their money, involving people in their community. What is just amazing is how easy Salk found it, not only to round up the 7,500 kids, but to round up pediatricians who are willing to give the shots, nurses who are willing to stand by, people who are willing to chauffeur these kids back and forth, record keepers. No one was being paid for this. It was all done voluntarily. And I think there was a sense in Pittsburgh that they were on the cusp of history.
Well, they had us lined up, and they called the name, and then they said it to you, and you were supposed to verify it. And then we were called into the area behind the screen and given a little stiff bear to hold on to while we got the shot. The needle was very long and very thick looking, and basically fearsome.
My brother, Tommy, he hated it. He would try to corner him, and he'd run under tables, under chairs, screaming, screaming his head off. And he didn't care about the cookies and the orange juice. He just didn't want to get a shot.
Not all parents found it easy to turn their kids over to the new vaccine.
Sid said he was glad that our kids could participate in the vaccine trials. I was a nervous wreck, frankly. I was scared to take them and scared not to take them, so I had to take them. But, you know, we weren't sure what this whole thing was. An experiment at that point, the vaccine.
The stakes were high for everyone, but especially for Jonas Salk.
I think with my father there were two parallel things going on. Complete and absolute confidence in what he was doing. I don't think there was a doubt in his mind. And yet at the same time, there's always doubt. There's always question. Is it going to work?
Jonas Salk, for all of his self-confidence, cannot possibly say that there is no chance of a kid getting polio from my vaccine. Vaccines are always a matter of risk versus reward, and nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect.
These are his neighbor's children. He was sticking with this dead virus. That's not like inoculating someone in another continent. It was very real. There were children who played Little League with his sons. There were children whose parents he saw walking in the streets of Squirrel Hill or in Oakland, worked at the university. So if you had harmed them, he would have been in a very, very difficult situation.
The Pittsburgh trials were quickly declared a success. Fears about the vaccine's safety were diminishing, but one critical step remained. In April of 1954, a final large-scale trial began across 44 states with a single vaccine. Since the March of Dimes was funding the vaccine, they decided the trial would be run by an independent board from the University of Michigan. But everyone knew this was Jonas Salk's vaccine. He was becoming a household name.
In April 1954, field trials of the Salk polio vaccine begin in dozens of selected communities throughout America. In the largest such test ever conducted, 1,800,000 children volunteered to participate. The vaccine, which has obsessed Jonas Salk for years, now begins to pass out of his hands.
The national trial got national press, and again the critics followed.
It's time, America. Time for Walter Winchell, the man who gives America the news.
On the eve of the field trials, Walter Winchell opened up his broadcast. Mothers and fathers of America, they're preparing coffins for your children because they're going to be doing this experiment on them and some of your children are going to die.
Walter Winchell was a yellow journalist of his time. He believed, as he said, that the way to become famous is to throw a brick at people that are famous. And that's what he did to Jonas Salk.
Salk himself went on air to answer the questions.
Studies that my associates and I have been doing at the University of Pittsburgh have indicated clearly that it is possible to induce antibody formation in children by suitable injections with a kill virus vaccine. More than that, it appears that there are no harmful ill effects accompanying these inoculations.
That didn't hurt, did it? Okay. O'Connor said, you have to do this. In order to get your vaccine done, Jonas, there's certain things you need to do. And again, he was able and willing to do the necessary things to get things done, even if it wasn't exactly in his line of work.
The press was one thing, but more disturbing to Salk were two decisions the panel made about the trial. Salk had labored for years to get the vaccine right, but at the last minute, the panel stepped in and actually changed the formula.
When the field trial was being planned, it was decided that it was going to be necessary to add methylate, a preservative, to the vaccine. Whereas my father knew the polio vaccine was going to work, I don't know how confident he was that this large-scale field trial was going to come out with the results he had anticipated. My father was deeply concerned.
Salk feared that preservative would actually damage the vaccine viruses and render them less effective, and that really upset Salk. He took this seriously. I mean, it was called the Salk vaccine.
The second decision that upset Salk was that it would be run as a placebo-controlled study. This meant that half the test subjects would get the vaccine, and half would receive an inactive substance, or placebo. Salk understood that the placebo group would provide valuable data, but in his mind, it also raised a troubling ethical issue.
He thought it was morally reprehensible to give some kids the vaccine and knowingly withhold it from some others.
He knew that this vaccine was going to work and went against his nature to be allowing kids to go unimmunized that otherwise would be able to get vaccine. Fortunately, wiser heads prevailed, and where he was being so guided by his heart was able to be counterbalanced, and the field trial was indeed structured as a placebo-controlled trial.
A placebo trial was the only way to test the vaccine for safety and effectiveness, both of which needed to be proven.
The fact that he did agree to a placebo-controlled trial was a major, major plus in the evaluation, and that has become the gold standard for testing vaccines, both for effectiveness and safety.
Salk agreed to the placebo group, but never agreed to the change in the vaccine's formula. Regardless of his fears, almost 2 million children were about to put their health in Salk's hands. Despite Jonas Salk's concerns about the national trial, he didn't even have the comfort of being able to monitor its progress. He was kept completely in the dark, forced to endure the suspense along with the rest of the country.
It takes a full year for the results to be analyzed. Everybody's nervous. Jonas Salk is confident, but doesn't know. No one tells him.
This is Tuesday, April 12th, 1955. A day which may well mark the most significant event in all of medical history. The world will very soon know whether the battle against the disease that has twisted hundreds of thousands of young bodies has been won.
Success or failure, whatever happened here would make headlines. Along with Jonas Salk, his wife and 3 sons, the world held its breath.
If the results from the observed study areas are employed, the vaccine could be considered 80 to 90% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
The vaccine worked. It was both safe and effective. It was a singular American moment. The beginning of the end of the disease so many feared. And the good news spread like wildfire.
The guy gets off the elevator and he hits the runway. He never got into the room. Everybody is yelling, "Give me one." A fellow from the university service stands up on this table and he's just throwing them. It works, they were yelling.
There were newspaper reporters that ran to telephones to quickly get this as a front page headline on probably every newspaper in this country. This was his moment.
It was a mob scene at Ann Arbor. I can remember that day so well. Television sets were set up in our school. Kids ran out into the streets. School was called. You know, factory whistles went off. Church bells tolled. People were crying. It was in a way as if a war had ended. And in a way a war had ended.
It was like something just being lifted, like just thought, oh, you know, my God, I just can't believe it. It's over. I mean, it's over for millions and millions of children.
And movie offers began to come in. 3 studios were very interested, and the rumors that Marlon Brando was going to play Jonas Salk.
He had a lot of self-confidence, so he always thought he would succeed, even though the amount we understood about vaccinology back then was way, way less than we do today. And it was great when the trial succeeded.
When the vaccine was declared safe, potent, and effective, that Jonas Salk became a national hero. He was on the cover of Time. Newsweek called him one of the greatest Americans. He got the Congressional Medal of Freedom. President Eisenhower invited him to the White House. He said, I just don't have the words to thank you. Ike was a grandfather.
Dr. Salk, before I hand you this citation, I have no words in which adequately to express the thanks of myself, all the people I know, and all 164 million Americans, to say nothing of all the other people in the world that will profit from your discovery. I am very, very happy to hand that to you.
This is a sign of how great medicine is, and particularly how great American medicine is at this time. It is an extraordinarily wonderful, optimistic moment, okay? And there is reason to be proud.
It was an absolutely extraordinary moment in time, and there were so many streams that fed into this. I think it really has to be remembered. This wasn't the work of one person. Everyone else in the laboratory, Dr. Youngner, Jim Lewis, Byron Bennett, Val Baisley, these people were remarkable in terms of their flexibility, their dedication, their willingness just to roll up their sleeves, plunge in, do whatever was necessary to get this done.
When the vaccine became successful, Salk did what the best scientists do, and what the most moral of them do, and what the most humanitarian of them do. And he said, this is a vaccine for the people. This is not a vaccine for my personal profit. And he made the famous statement, you can't patent the sun. The sun is for the people. This vaccine is science's gift to the people. It was an extraordinary act.
The race between Salk and Sabin was over. Salk was the first to market, and it took Sabin another 7 years to complete his version of the vaccine.
Well, it's certainly a huge milestone in human health, because the idea of mass vaccination campaigns and the ability to create new vaccines, that's the iconic incident. And Salk himself became, this very famous person. It was a huge achievement.
Sabin also refused to patent his vaccine. Both vaccines spread around the world, and both have been in continuous use since the time of their creation. Today, we are close to realizing Salk's ultimate dream: total elimination of polio from the globe. In the 1950s, polio infected at least 600,000 people around the world every year. But as the vaccine spread, their effects were nothing short of amazing. By 1980, polio was eradicated from the United States. By 1994, the Americas were certified polio-free. The Western Pacific region, spanning from Australia to China, was polio-free in 2000. And by 2002, Europe. One country after another has eliminated the disease, the most recent being India, which marked its first polio-free year in 2012. Today, 3 countries are still fighting endemic polio: Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. If all goes well, the world will be polio-free by 2018. It'll take cutting-edge technology to finish the job.
So understanding how it's spreading, where it's spreading, we understand that very well. Now, we have satellite maps to see where villages are. We have GPS trackers, and we've got the internet to exchange data. And we're having to bring it all to bear in order to get these last 3 countries finished.
Groups like the Gates Foundation, Rotary International, and the World Health Organization are united in the effort.
Polio eradication is the thing I spend most of my time on, and our foundation will have given several $1 billion to it by the time it gets done. Well, I wake up every day thinking, are we doing everything we can? And I'm using my credibility to go out and say to people, hey, keep the faith, keep giving to this.
In the history of the world, we've eradicated only one other human disease, smallpox. To eradicate polio, we have the vaccines and we have the technology. All we need now is the will to get it done.